everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. And Daniel, good to see you.
Happy Monday, Dr. Paul. How are you?
I'm doing fine
Good.
and dandy, and we've had lots of problems to deal with, and we talk about coronavirus now and then. And, we've talked about the economy a bit. But, we used to talk a whole lot about foreign policy.
Yeah.
And I don't think that means it's been diminished. It's just that the news is overwhelming. People are curious and concerned about, how deadly the virus is. And so this is all big news. Today we're not going to talk about that, but you'd say, well, the pandemic is over, the epidemic is over, and there's really not much left there. But you say, what do you mean? All I have to do is turn the TV on, and it's deadly. Everybody's going to die from it. But when you come to the conclusion that there's a lot of distortion, and we've talked about where those distortions are, we'll continue, obviously, to keep talking about this because it has participated so much in the lockdown, especially with the disintegration of our economy. So it's a big issue, but not because everybody was going to die from it. So. Anyway, but today I wanted to talk about Iran.
Yeah.
The sanctions that we put on and the way we throw our weight around. It makes me think about what Bobby Kennedy said the other day when I suggested, well, can you have a republic when you have the CIA? And he turned it. Flipped it a little bit. He says, I'll tell you one thing, you can't have a republic if you have an imperialistic foreign policy.
Yeah.
So he
Absolutely.
was very, very strong on that. And of course, we don't like, the intervention, imperialistic government. But that's what we have. We have had the strong currency, we've had the wealth, we're a wealthy country, we've had the military, and we have control of the financial markets. To a degree now they are starting to be diminished, but nevertheless we can and we have thrown our weight around. And even not too long ago when we put on sanctions on Iran, we got the UN to go along with it.
Yeah.
Even the Europeans went along with it. But now there's a different story. People are disgusted with it. And yet we are at a point where people want to have a better approach to this. They had the UN sanctions are up for a new vote. And they had a vote this week, and it looks like our policy is very weak. We didn't get any support from it, and that is another sign. But the friction is growing. It's growing very much, and it's been aggravated with the recently signed treaty by UAE and Israel. That can't help settle peace in the world and this sort of thing. But so it's very much in flux, and I think that it's at the rate we're going with both administrations, whether it's Republican or Democrat, are moving in the directions that we'll change nothing. We're going to be interventionists. We're going to be imperialistic. We are going to be inflationary. We are going to rule the world until we can't rule the world anymore. So I think there's a lot of major things going on now, especially with Iran. And the subject will come up in our discussion about the ships that we took that were on their way to deliver oil to the people of Venezuela. Yeah, they're messed up, but the people are messed up and have become dependent on it. But just to punish the people and the hospitals and who knows what isn't hardly a solution to finding, to encourage, better relationships with Venezuela. But that, to say better relationships with Venezuela, what are you guys? Who do you represent? Well,
the communists?
Maybe they'll come our way.
Yeah.
So that's the goal of talking to people. We've mentioned so often, Cuba, how long we've been antagonistic toward Cuba, and maybe talking with them and trading with them a lot sooner would have been helpful.
We've tried to give Trump the benefit of the doubt when he does something that we agree with, that we think is moving us toward a more intelligent, more peaceful foreign policy. And we've done that, but at the same time, we get some criticism. But we have to also call out a really an utterly failed policy. And we'll continue to, of course, give him praise, but unfortunately, there's been a consistency in Trump's Iran policy. He said it on the campaign trail. He's actually continued to do it. And it has not given the results that were promised. In fact, things are much worse, depending on your perspective. If you're a neocon, you might think, this is pretty good. We're getting closer to war. But for the rest of us, the people who actually have a brain and a conscience, it's been a complete disaster. And normally in those situations, you'd rethink your policy if it's not producing the right results. But of course, we're talking about Washington, so the answer is to double down. But what triggered this discussion of ours is over the weekend, on Friday, they were holding a vote in the UN Security Council. The U.S. put a proposal forth to extend the total arms embargo against Iran, which is set to expire in October, as a function of the JCPOA agreement, the Iran deal. And this is part of it. This was kind of a rolling relaxing of sanctions as Iran continued to fulfill its obligations and the signatories continued to fulfill theirs. Well, this was the next step, and it was set to expire in October. And of course, the U.S. can't stand that. That can't happen. So what did they do? They sent the greatest diplomat in the history of the world, Mike Pompeo. He spent all summer twisting arms in Europe and elsewhere, trying to get the UN Security Council to vote with the United States to extend these sanctions. And unfortunately, with all of his charm, what a shock, he was unsuccessful. And it was absolutely a rout for the U.S. There were 11 abstentions. The only yes vote the U.S. got was that mighty powerhouse, the Dominican Republic, which voted for us. Otherwise, a complete failure. So that means that they are not able to push this forward. What they were hoping to do, Dr. Paul, because they knew they couldn't pass it, because Russia and China would have vetoed it. But if they could have triggered a Russia-China veto, they could have had a symbolic victory in saying, hey, well, it was vetoed, but we had the majority on the Security Council, we have the momentum. So that was what the best case scenario was. They didn't even get that. It was an utter wash.
Sometimes you wonder how they can get people up at the top of the ladder like Pompeo, I think he's a neocon, as I recall. And what about, if he needs a little help, he can always go and get advice from Eliot Abrams. That'll help him, too.
Yeah.
No, the advisors, for foreign policy aren't on the side of our position of non-intervention. The talk may be of one thing, but strategically it's always the same thing. And, when this treaty that was signed with UAE and with Israel, the one headline that caught my attention, and it could very easily come from our administration, there will be a tremendous increase in sales of weapons to the UAE. Can you believe that? The ink isn't even dry, and they're counting the money they're going to make. Just like that's what the world needs, are more weapons. That doesn't mean that weapons cause war, but and to defend our country, we don't need more weapons. But it's all part of this game they play. And people say, well, no, we might not need them, but we need to have some profits in these trying times.
Yeah, right.
So we will sell the weapons to the UAE, and they can be strong, and then we won't have to send any more weapons over there and that kind of nonsense. But they're always in the middle of it. The military-industrial complex, very, very powerful. I am sensing that that our hopes are fading a bit about the deep state not having as much influence. But when you look at what we're talking about, this is deep state stuff. This is deep state stuff. And then what about the deep state influence on the money being spent? Huge amounts of money, and that's Federal Reserve stuff. So the deep state is alive and well. The people are getting poorer. The people in this country are getting poorer, and it's all it's doing is galvanizing the radicals. They're going to burn down the cities because they want to usher in the saviors in Marxists. They're going to come in and say, look how these free market people did. You had the conservative Republicans charged. Look at what's happening. So it's a real challenge for us to keep the message going, but there's a lot of people, are sensing that there's something seriously wrong with our policies in a bipartisan way.
Well, on those arms sale, there's the silver lining in the cloud. The middle class in America might say, what's that have to do with me, But the fact is, it does affect them, and it does affect their bottom line. It is making them poorer because we're all taxed to pay for the development of these weapons that the private companies private companies develop, as you know, Dr. Paul, that money comes out of our pocket. Then they develop these weapons and then they sell them overseas and they privatize the profits. They socialize the cost of developing them, privatize the profits. The extremely wealthy, all the people, all the Beltway bandits get richer and richer. Meanwhile, the rest of us working and middle-class Americans get poorer.
You know, they throw terms around a lot. You know, Marxism, fascism, anti-fascism, and all this. But you just described what I believe is fascism. Yeah. You know, and fascism doesn't mean that they actually take legal ownership of these companies. You know, Boeing isn't owned; they're owned by a private company, but their livelihood depends on the government. I don't think Boeing's going to fail. I don't think these big companies are going to fail, and so they go along with it. And the blame goes. This is what gripes me up so often. The blame goes to us who believe in free markets. They say, "See what free markets do," you know. And yet, at the same time, we realize that it's a bipartisan support for a fascistic intervention. And if you don't want to use the word fascist, it's crony capitalism. It's not free markets.
Yeah.
It's not sound money, and it has nothing to do with balanced budgets and promoting liberty.
Yeah. Welfare for the rich. Well, you know, back on the Iran thing, what happened is that instead of taking this as a sign in the Security Council that, our policy isn't working, nobody supports it in the world, all PS5+1, all of the parties to the Iran deal abstained from the vote. So we didn't get a single member of that. Instead of saying this isn't working, it's probably an idea to make a change. Of course, unfortunately, the Trump administration doubles down on an idiotic idea. And so on Saturday, the president said, we're going to do the snapback sanctions. You wait, it's going to happen this week. Well, these snapback sanctions are something that was built into the deal when it was negotiated. And essentially, it means that if Iran, through the course of it having sanctions lifted piece by piece, through that course of progress, if they violate the agreement, then all the sanctions snap back at once. So it's a really strong incentive for them not to backlash, to step back from their obligations. So the U.S. is going to contend that Iran violated this deal and it's going to snap back all the sanctions. But what's interesting is that the other signatories of the deal said, you can't do that. You got out of the deal. Yeah. You're not part of it. You took your marbles and went home, and now you want to dictate the rules to the rest of us who stayed. And here's the foreign policy chief of the European Union. Here's what he said, and you can't argue with it. He said, given that the U.S. unilaterally withdrew from the JCPOA in May 2018 and has not participated in any structures or activities subsequently, the U.S. cannot be considered as a JCPOA participant. We therefore consider that the U.S. is not in a position to resort to mechanisms reserved for JCPOA participants, such as the so-called snapback.
Yeah, this is, I guess, arrogance at its greatest. How can we make that assumption, and how will people react? A world that wants to work toward peace, we should be able to talk to people. We should be able to trade with people. Both countries of the world, of both factions, all the countries of the world have their imperfections, but people usually overlook these imperfections when there's a little real economic benefits by coordination, buying and selling. You buy something here, you have to sell the money here, and yet it's amazing that under these conditions that we're living with a lot of support for protectionism. That's going to solve this problem, but it isn't. It needs more management once it gets too much managed, and that is that we have all these international agreements and IMF and World Bank and all these sanctions that are put on is the last thing in the world from a free market economy. But if people really, really cared about it, they would be going in a different direction. And it's amazing that the emphasis, and the libertarians and the conservatives really miss this point that, they build up, maybe the Europeans are getting tired of it, they build this animosity against Iran. And they were pointing out, well, there's a difference. But it always should be, it's not Maduro, he's going to do well. It's the people.
Yeah.
Even those who ascribe to socialism in our Congress, I noticed they didn't care about the well-being of a person in another country. I say, oh, that's not our responsibility. But you shouldn't hurt them then.
Yeah.
Why go to the point of subsidizing their leaders? It just doesn't make any sense if people would be more concerned about how these policies, including our policy. Now look at the people, street people. I never dreamed that I would see New York boarded up,
Yeah, it's
and
amazing.
San Francisco with tents all over the place, and we're not able to explain to them, well, it has something to do with bad government. We have two problems in Washington, Republicans and Democrats, and they practice the same law. They all went to the same college. They all believe in the same economic policy and interventionism, and they didn't yell and scream about getting involved in these treaties, and putting on sanctions. But when they come back to hit home, then why did they do that? But they don't have a basic principle that they follow. It's on here,
Yeah.
flip flop, and all over the place. And I think that basically the theme ought to be, for people who care about liberty, is caring about middle class. And those aren't just words, because everybody's for the middle class, but there's so much evidence to show the freer a society, the larger the middle class, and the least amount of poor. And guess which country was the champion? United States.
Yeah.
But that's long gone. It's all, if there's a family surviving right now, it's because we're just printing money like crazy, and the world's still taking the dollars. So that's the only way. They're just hanging on there by their fingernails just to get in a food line. Did you see this thing the other day? It was astounding to me that the number of cars that were lined up in Austin to pick up food.
Thousands of cars.
Thousands of cars. That is, there's something rotten when it comes to policy, because it just doesn't come from the sky. Oh yeah, no, this one did. It came all because there was a virus, and the virus was the whole thing that caused all of these problems. Well, that was just a gimmick to try to shift the blame from bad economic and monetary policy.
They should have had Fauci at the front line passing out bread, because he's one of the ones that caused the
Great
problem.
line.
Well, finishing up on Iran, just one last point. I know you've got some headlines you want to go into, and I've got a couple bullet points too. But I think it's clear that the U.S. really wants to provoke Iran into doing something very radical. I think the seizure of these ships the other day, they were hoping Iran would do something in the Persian Gulf that they could escalate. This is what they're hoping for. Eliot Abrams, as you pointed out last week, was named the new envoy for Iran overthrow of government. And you know that he's got a lot of dirty tricks up his sleeve. His entire career has been a career of dirty tricks. When this expires in October, this weapons embargo, China or Russia will sell weapons to Iran. That might be the next opportunity for the neocons to ratchet it up. But do they really want to take on Iran, China, and Russia? If anything, they're pushing the three of these countries closer together. They already have economic relationships that are strong. Those will continue to strengthen, where our relationships weaken because ours are only based on force and the charm and diplomacy of Mike Pompeo. So we're about to fail. But you have a few things you've been looking at.
Here's the headline, but we've already touched on this very well, and you've mentioned it. The headline tells a whole lot about the issue. U.S. fails utterly in Friday's night UN vote, Security Council vote on extending Iran arms embargo. That's the whole point that we talk about. To me, the big picture is, the diminishing influence that we have in the world. And maybe one of the big issues coming up now is the division and the desertion of the Europeans from the United States, where before, it was always money and we were had all the weapons and all, but especially with the Iran policy, there has been a decisive change. Okay, here's another one on the UAE-Israel peace deal. Don't be hoodwinked by Trump's UAE-Israel peace deal, because it's very unlikely that that's going to happen. Of course, when there is one and it's there, and even if it's imperfect, there's nothing wrong with working with it, because that was why we actually, supported not us getting out of the Iranian nuclear deal. But nevertheless, we did, and that's still part of the big problem. But this has a lot to do probably with Israel more than anything else, and the settlements and the Israeli problems. And when I look at what happens with the settlements, it sort of bothers me a great deal. And then this last one, Israel and UAE agreed to full normalization of ties. Well. They were pretty close anyway. It's not a huge country, but it has a great symbolism, and it does send the message that that even with this, the real numbers over there didn't agree with us. You know, this sounds like, oh, we're moving in this right direction, and this will solve the problem. But the other thing. They said the treaty was signed, between two countries that live near each other, but the treaty was signed in Washington. Doesn't that tell you something?
A lot.
So, oh, that means we have an interest there. Yeah, we've already mentioned it. We get to sell more weapons. So there.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna start a new segment, Dr. Paul. Maybe we'll do it on Mondays, but I'm going to call it Losers and Winners. You look in the news and you see who the losers and who the winners are. And I have a few clips to demonstrate it, and it'll be very fast. But let's look at the first one. And this you've written about this week in your column, and I urge everyone to have a look at it at ronpaulinstitute.org. But one loser is Tony Fauci. He's been dumped. President Trump is looking to Dr. Scott Atlas. We talked a little bit about it last week. Scott Atlas is an opponent of lockdowns. He's in favor of opening schools. He thinks that lockdowns cause the coronavirus problem to be worse, not better. And speaking of that, here are the next losers. The government of Argentina. Let's have a look at this. After 146 days in lockdown, Argentina's virus problem is getting worse. Gee, you'd think that after 146 days of doing this and the problem getting worse, that they might change. It's like beating your head against the wall for 146 days and wondering why you have a headache. So, yeah, Argentina, you guys are losers. Let's next. Next is the people of Massachusetts, sadly. They're victims, not really losers. But if you look at the Massachusetts General Hospital, they have 14 people in the whole hospital with COVID. There is only one person in the ICU, and that is out of 1,000 available beds. Yet Massachusetts is still in shutdown, is still in restriction. What will it take for them to say, okay, we've got it, it's done? Next loser, unfortunately, is a little closer to home, Dr. Paul, and this is a loser and a wannabe tyrant, Governor Greg Abbott. He says that the hospitalizations and the positive cases must decrease before he'll allow bars to reopen in Texas. They call him King Abbott down here because of the way he's behaving. And here's something really interesting, Dr. Paul, that we might go into at some other time, which is that the entire numbers of positivity in Texas are now complete trash. It turns out we talked about this body of tests that they had. They counted toward tests, but they didn't have results. It's a huge scandal. Even Abbott has to look into it to figure out what's happening. Two quick winners, if we can, because we can't just end on a bad note. If we can look at the next one. Here's the big winner, and here we are huge fans of her. Governor Kristi Noem of South Dakota. She has rejected President Trump's virus unemployment relief, saying our economy is healthy because we didn't lock down. She said, quote, her administration is very grateful to Trump, but the aid is ultimately unnecessary. We didn't destroy our economy over a virus. And the final winner is going to be the people of this country long suffering under this virus. This is from the New York Times, the chief scaremongers. Scientists see signs of lasting immunity to COVID-19 even after mild infections.
At the same time, they're telling us the virus or the vaccines they're planning for probably aren't going to be too good. They're about 50%. You might have to get 3 or 4 shots because it keeps us busy. You'd think the people would, connect with that. But opening up is a real challenge. Closing, a big deal too, but you picked winners and losers. Some things were essentials, but churches were unessential. Then we find out that mental illness and locked in their home was a very deadly situation. So there's a lot of problems there. But opening up these schools, it's just amazing. I bet you they don't have any problems with opening up schools in South Dakota.
Yeah.
I bet they're open, and nobody's even talking about it. In other places, they're still not open. Then there's going to be all these regulations. Can you imagine a 7, an 8, and a 9-year-old kid going to school and wearing a mask?
It's abuse. It's child abuse.
Oh, it is criminal. It is criminal as it goes on. But then there's the other people, organized groups that say, oh, no, it's too dangerous and we're not going to be exposed. So the teachers union are dead set against this. But we need to have more assurance that there will be never anybody ever get a cold again. So this is so distasteful what's going on. At the same time, the evidence is so strong that pretty soon, maybe the announcement will be heard. The pandemic never existed. The epidemic is gone, and the virus has been contained. Let's all go to work, and let's all go back to school. Let's open up baseball fields and football fields, and let's get the streets cleaned up in the meantime, and quit finding another excuse for the rioting and burning down our cities. We could deal with that too. So there's a lot of things that could be done, and most of it is do less of what the government's doing. Just do less, because when we look at the problems we have, you can always go back to the real source of the problem. And you say that the government caused all the problems with somebody getting a virus, and because the virus, it could be very, very deadly. No, it's just that it was made worse. We talk about it endlessly, the lockdowns and all these things. The government is really not our friend. I'd like to say they should be, and they could be, but the secret to a government in a republic is that they're doing less, and that they have rules and prohibitions against government power being used against the people, and not recognizing the importance of the individual, the importance of the individuals taking care of themselves. That's the individual that should make the decision, not the bureaucrats, not the Faucis of the world, and not the unions of the world and the school teachers. They just need to get out of the way, because even with all the imperfections that we all have to deal with, it's so much better than putting the worst at the top and they making the decisions, and we all have to suffer the consequences. And that's what we're witnessing now. Too many decisions made in Washington, but right now everybody says, I can't even pay my rent unless they don't send me a check. Well, I understand that, but I also understand that is a consequence of allowing our government to issue bills and issue enough money, trillions and trillions of dollars. Nobody can even keep up with it, and then they wonder why it's not functioning. And I think that economic nonsense that's coming on, the economic breakdown, the inflation, and the malinvestment, and the unemployment, unfortunately, it's just starting because we have not released the creative energy back to the individual. We still say we have to control it. We have one of the most conservative states in the nation, and we have a governor that adds fuel to the fire of these problems. So I just don't think it's that complicated, and I think that's what we need. We need more information out there. We have to have more people confident that freedom works and that they can take care of themselves, and the government does not solve our problems. They get us in wars when we shouldn't have involved. They're the ones who undermine our liberties, and they were supposed to be set up to protect our freedom, and really not much else. So we'll continue with that message, and I know we have a lot of supporters, and we want to continue that. I hope we can get more people to join us here at the Liberty Committee, and hope to see all of you back here soon.